Get in the ring, Miss Paperwork, or I'll drag you in myself and let everyone watch what happens to a woman who thinks she can tell my family what to do." Tyler Kane spat those words at me across the driveway, his knuckles already wrapped in white tape, his father standing behind him with his arms crossed and a smile that had never once in his life been kind. I stood there on the pavement between my mailbox and his father's brand new koi pond, holding a grocery bag in one hand, looking at the two men who had spent 4 months trying to convince the whole street that I was nothing. They had no idea that the woman they were laughing at had spent 11 years reading spreadsheets the way other people read faces, finding the exact place where a lie starts to bleed, and they had no idea that their entire fortune was already sitting in a file on my desk with a red flag stapled to the front of it. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second and like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. My name is Diane Marsh. I am 44 years old, and for 11 years I have worked as a federal bank examiner for a regional office that most people have never heard of and would find deeply boring if they had. Before that, I spent 6 years in the Army as a legal specialist attached to a criminal investigation division, which is a polite way of saying I learned how to take apart a lie one thread at a time until the whole thing came undone in my hands. When I left the service, I carried that skill with me the way some people carry a limp, quietly, permanently, in every room I ever walked into. I traded my uniform for a gray blazer and a laptop bag, and I traded combat zones for something almost nobody warns you is just as dangerous in its own slow, suffocating way, which is the world of men who have never once in their lives been told no. To my neighbors, I was Diane from the tan house on the corner, the one who worked some kind of desk job downtown, the one whose son rode his bike up and down the cul-de-sac every evening after dinner. I never corrected anyone who assumed I did filing or scheduling or something forgettable. I let them believe it because the version of my job that mattered, the version where I sat across a conference table from bank presidents and told them, calmly, exactly which numbers in their books did not add up, was not something I discussed at block parties. My son Caleb was 11 that year, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of kid who noticed when a bird's nest disappeared from a tree before anyone else did. His father had passed 4 years earlier, a car accident on a wet highway in October, and since then it had been the two of us, building a small, careful, ordinary life in a small, careful, ordinary house that I had bought with money I earned one audit at a time. Every morning followed the same rhythm. I would wake before Caleb, make coffee in the same chipped mug I'd had since college, and stand at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the fence line while I mentally walked through whatever file was open on my desk that week. It's a habit from the service that never left me, that quiet scanning, that low hum of situational awareness that never fully powers down even when the only threat on the horizon is supposed to be a squirrel getting into the bird feeder. I noticed things. I always notice things. It was the entire reason I was good at my job, and it would turn out to be the entire reason the Kane family's collapse started in my kitchen and not in a courtroom 3 years later. The moving trucks came on a Saturday in April, 6 of them, backed one after another into the driveway of the big house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one that had sat empty for 8 months after old Mr. Alvarez passed away, and his kids sold it to the highest bidder without ever once walking through it themselves. The highest bidder was Walter Kane, and within 48 hours, the entire street understood exactly what that meant. A landscaping crew arrived first, tearing out Mr. Alvarez's modest rose beds and replacing them with a koi pond the size of a small swimming pool, complete with an imported stone bridge that 4 men struggled to carry through the side gate. Then came the furniture, sectional after sectional wrapped in plastic, a home gym's worth of equipment unloaded piece by piece into what used to be a 2-car garage. And finally, trailing behind a black pickup truck with tires too large for any road it would ever actually need to drive on, came Tyler. Tyler Kane was 26 years old, built like a refrigerator that had decided to take up boxing, and moved through the world with the specific, particular arrogance of a man who has been told his entire life that his body was an argument nobody could win against. He had fought in a handful of regional amateur bouts, won 2 of them against opponents who were clearly overmatched from the opening bell, and talked about those 2 wins the way other men talk about wars they survived. Within the first hour of moving in, he had a punching bag hanging from a steel frame, bolted directly against the fence that separated his father's property from mine, close enough that every hit sent a small tremor through my kitchen window. I stood there with my coffee and watched him work the bag with sloppy, showy combinations, more interested in how he looked doing it than in whether any of it would actually protect him in a real fight, and some old, quiet part of my brain filed the information away without my even asking it to. Open stance. Guard drops after the third punch. Weight stays on his heels. That part of me had gone dormant for years, but it had never actually gone away. Walter Kane, Tyler's father, was the kind of man whose money had arrived faster than his character had, which is to say his character had never really arrived at all. He ran a company called Kane Regional Holdings, a mid-sized real estate and development firm that had grown explosively over the previous 6 years by buying up distressed properties, flipping them fast, and leveraging every dollar of profit into the next, bigger acquisition. He drove a car that cost more than my house, wore a watch that cost more than my car, and had a way of looking at everything around him, my lawn, my mailbox, my son's bicycle leaning against the porch, like it was evidence of a life poorly managed. He drove past my driveway that first week at a deliberate crawl, letting his engine idle a beat too long, and I understood immediately that he wanted me to notice him noticing me. I did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I have spent my career learning that the men who need you to react are always the ones with the most to hide. The connection to my family arrived 3 days later, and it landed like a slow-motion collision I had somehow not seen coming despite every instinct I had telling me to watch that house. My younger sister, Renee, had married into money 2 years earlier, a whirlwind courtship with a man she'd met at a charity gala. And it wasn't until I watched her Range Rover pull into the Kane driveway, wasn't until I watched her walk at the front door of that house in a robe like she owned the place, that I understood the man she had married, a mid-level executive at Kane Regional Holdings named Derek, was Walter Kane's nephew. And that the 2 of them had just moved in 2 doors down from her own sister, without ever once mentioning it. Renee showed up at my door that same afternoon, letting herself in the way she always had since we were kids, dropping her bag on my kitchen table like she was staking a claim on it. She spent 20 minutes describing the pool the Kanes were putting in, the imported tile, the outdoor kitchen with a pizza oven flown in from somewhere in Italy, all while her eyes drifted across my second-hand curtains and the crayon drawings taped to my refrigerator door. She picked up the coffee I'd poured her without asking, took one sip, and set it back down like it had personally disappointed her. "You know, Diane," she said, twisting the new diamond on her finger so it caught the light, "you really could have more than this if you tried." I didn't say anything. I turned toward the sink and started rinsing dishes, and I let her sit there in the silence until she got bored of it and left, trailing perfume that cost more than my weekly groceries. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters to how the rest of this story lands. I did not hate my sister in that moment. I felt something closer to grief, the particular, quiet grief of watching someone you love choose a version of themselves that has no room left for you in it. I finished the dishes. I picked Caleb up from soccer practice an hour later, and I did not think about the diamond ring again until it started showing up, again and again. In places it had no business being. Tyler's harassment did not begin all at once. It built the way water damage builds, slow and mostly invisible until the ceiling caves in. He let his dog into my yard without a leash and laughed when it dug up the tomatoes I'd been growing since March. He blocked the end of the cul-de-sac with his truck during Caleb's bus pickup, forcing the driver to honk twice before he'd bother moving it. He played music loud enough that it rattled my windows on weeknights, timed, it seemed, specifically for whenever Caleb was trying to do homework at the kitchen table. I documented none of it in any formal way at first, because I genuinely believed, the way you believe about a summer storm, that it would pass on its own if I simply didn't feed it. It did not pass. It found its target instead, and its target was my son. It happened on a Tuesday in June, hot enough that the asphalt was shimmering, the kind of afternoon where the whole neighborhood smells like sunscreen and cut grass. Caleb was in the driveway washing my car, a task he'd taken on that summer because he liked the responsibility of it, the hose in one hand and a sponge in the other, humming along to something playing low on his phone propped against the windshield. Tyler came across the property line without a word of warning, sweat-soaked from his workout, and reached through the open driver's side window to snatch Caleb's phone off the dash. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He just held it up, looked at whatever song was playing, and dropped it onto the wet driveway hard enough that the screen split down the middle in a spider web of cracks. "Turn that garbage off," he said, not even looking at my son, already turning to walk back toward his own yard like the moment hadn't cost anything at all. I was standing at the kitchen window when it happened. I heard the crack of the screen against the concrete before I processed what it was. And by the time I understood, I was already moving, out the back door and down the driveway with a stillness in my chest that I recognized from another life entirely. A stillness that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with control. Caleb had shrunk back against the car, sponge dropped in the driveway, soap suds sliding down his forearm, his face doing that thing where a kid is too stunned to even know if he's supposed to cry yet. I walked up to Tyler and I did not raise my voice, because raising my voice would have meant he'd won something. "Pick that up," I said, "and pay for it." He turned around slowly, looked me up and down the way you'd size up a vending machine that had given you the wrong snack, and laughed, actually laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Or what?" he said. "What exactly are you going to do about it, Miss Paperwork? I want you to understand something about that nickname, because it's going to matter later." Somewhere in those first few weeks, Tyler had asked his father what I did for a living, and Walter, who had clearly done exactly the kind of surface-level digging that men like him always do, had told him I worked some low-level clerical job downtown. Miss Paperwork became their private joke, tossed around whenever they wanted to remind me and each other exactly how small they believed I was. I let them have it. I let them believe every word of it, because there is nothing more useful in this world than being underestimated by someone who is about to need you not to be. I told Tyler, quietly, that if he ever touched my son's things again, or came onto my property again, I would involve the police and I would involve a lawyer, and I meant every word of it in the ordinary way any parent would mean it. He smirked, said something about how cute it was that I thought either of those things could touch his family, and walked away. I picked my son's phone up off the wet driveway, held its cracked screen in my palm, and I felt something inside me shift into a register I hadn't used in a long time. Not anger, exactly. Recalibration. That night after Caleb was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and I did something I want to be honest with you about, because I think it's important. I did not open a case file on the Kane family that night. I would never have crossed that particular line for personal reasons. Not then, not ever, because the entire value of my work rests on the fact that I don't. What I did instead was far simpler and far more ordinary. I opened the public business registry for the state, typed in Kane Regional Holdings, and started reading, the way anyone with an internet connection could have. I found the corporate filings. I found the list of registered agents. I found, buried 3 pages deep in a local business journal archive, a mention of a pending federal contract review tied to a subsidiary of Kane Regional Holdings, a company called Meridian Point Development, that had bid on a large mixed-income housing project financed in part through a federally backed loan program. I did not connect any dots that night. I want to be very clear about that. What I felt, sitting at my kitchen table with a cracked phone on the counter beside me, was not the satisfaction of a plan forming. It was the quiet, professional recognition of a name I had seen somewhere before, filed away in the part of my brain that never really stops working even when I want it to. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. And 3 weeks later, when a new case file crossed my actual desk at the federal examiner's office, a routine compliance review flagged by an automated system for irregular loan disbursement patterns, I opened it and found myself looking, for the second time, at the name Meridian Point Development. I want to walk you through what that actually meant, because it's the hinge this entire story turns on, and I think it deserves to be explained properly rather than rushed past. My job as a federal bank examiner involves reviewing whether financial institutions and the entities they lend to are complying with federal regulations, particularly around loans that carry government backing or guarantees. Meridian Point Development had received a substantial federally guaranteed construction loan tied to a promise to build affordable housing units as part of a regional development initiative. The file that landed on my desk showed disbursement requests that didn't line up cleanly with construction progress reports, invoices for materials that had been submitted twice under slightly altered vendor names, and a pattern of fund transfers that moved money out of the project account faster than any legitimate construction timeline could explain. It was not proof of anything yet. It was a pattern, the kind of pattern that gets flagged, assigned to an examiner, and quietly investigated over the following weeks, exactly the way any other file would be. I did not choose this case. I want to say that plainly, because I know how it might look from the outside. The file was assigned to me through the same automated rotation every file goes through, based on caseload and specialization, weeks before I had any idea Meridian Point traced back to my own neighbor. When I saw the connection, I did what any examiner is required to do, which was disclose it immediately to my supervisor and request a conflict review. My supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia who had trained half the examiners in our regional office, looked at my declaration, looked at the case file, and made a decision that would end up mattering more than either of us understood in that moment. She kept me on the file. Not despite the conflict, but because of what it told her about my judgment. "You disclosed it before anyone asked," she said. "That tells me you're exactly the person who should finish it. Just document everything." Patricia paired me with a second examiner, a younger man named Josh who had a talent for construction cost modeling that I have never come close to matching. And together, we spent the better part of 2 months rebuilding, line by line, what Meridian Point's project actually should have cost against what it claimed to have spent. It is slow, unglamorous work, the kind that never makes it into a movie about federal investigations. Its spreadsheets open until midnight. It's cross-referencing a concrete pour date against a weather report to see whether the invoice submitted for that pour could possibly be real. It's calling a building materials supplier in another state and asking, politely, whether they actually shipped the tonnage of rebar listed on an invoice bearing their name, and writing down, word for word, their confused answer that they had never done business with a company called Meridian Point Development at all. I remember one night in particular, sitting at my kitchen table long after Caleb had gone to bed, staring at 2 invoices side by side on my laptop screen. Same amount, same rough date. 2 entirely different vendor names. One of them a company that, when I searched the state registry, turned out to have been formed only 6 weeks earlier by a registered agent whose address matched, almost exactly, the address of Walter Kane's accountant. I sat there for a long time after I found that, not because I didn't know what it meant, but because I did, and because I understood, in that quiet kitchen with the refrigerator humming behind me, that I was looking at the exact moment a man's entire empire had quietly, permanently, tipped over into fraud. I did not tell anyone in the neighborhood any of this, obviously. I didn't tell Renee. I didn't even tell Caleb, beyond the general, careful truth that my work was busy that summer and that I needed a bit more quiet in the evenings than usual. I went to block parties. I waved at Mrs. Ackhafer over the fence. I watched Tyler work his heavy bag with the same sloppy footwork I'd cataloged back in April. And I said nothing, because saying nothing was the job, and because I have never once, in 11 years of doing this work, let my personal feelings about a subject change a single number on a page. The numbers had to be true regardless of how I felt about the man they belonged to. That discipline is, I think, the actual core of everything I do, and it's the same discipline I was trying, in my own quiet way, to teach my son every time I told him to stay calm instead of getting even. So I did. I want you to picture what the rest of that summer actually looked like from the outside, because it looked like absolutely nothing. It looked like a tired single mother going to work, coming home, making dinner, helping her son with a summer reading list, occasionally standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee watching a man 3 houses down build a life he had not yet realized was made of sand. On the inside, it looked like something else entirely. Every evening after Caleb went to bed, I sat with the file, cross-referencing disbursement dates against public construction permits, matching invoice numbers against vendor registrations, building, slowly and methodically, the kind of paper trail that doesn't fall apart under pressure, because it was never built to impress anyone in the first place, only to be true. I should tell you about the week in between, because it matters, and because I think people who haven't lived next door to someone like Tyler Kane don't always understand how these things build. It isn't one dramatic moment. It's 100 small ones, stacked so close together that by the time you notice the pile, it's already taller than you are. 2 days after the phone incident, I came home from work to find my mailbox lying in the grass. The little wooden post it had stood on for 6 years snapped clean at the base. There was no note, no admission, nothing you could take to a police station and call evidence. Just a mailbox on its side in wet grass and a truck-sized set of tire tracks curving suspiciously close to where it used to stand. I didn't confront anyone about it. I bought a new post that weekend, dug the hole myself in the heat with Caleb handing me tools like a solemn little foreman, and set the new mailbox 2 feet further back from the road than the old one had been. It was a small, quiet decision, but it was also, I think now, the first time I started building a perimeter instead of just enduring one. The following week, Walter hosted what he called a summer kickoff party, though it was really just an excuse to show off the finished koi pond and the outdoor kitchen to a rotating cast of business associates who arrived in cars that all looked slightly too new. The noise from that party ran until nearly 1 in the morning, bass thudding through the shared fence line hard enough that I could feel it in the floorboards of Caleb's bedroom. I called the non-emergency line twice. Both times, an officer came out, spoke briefly with whoever answered the Kane's door, and left without the noise dropping by more than a few decibels for more than about 10 minutes. I understood, watching the patrol car pull away the second time, exactly how much weight a polite request carries against a man who has never once had to take one seriously. It was around this time that Tyler started what I can only describe as a low-grade campaign of intimidation, aimed specifically at making sure I knew he'd notice me noticing him. He would stand at the edge of his property while I got the mail, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching, the way a dog paces the length of a fence it's testing for weak spots. He asked Caleb once, while my son was walking home from the bus stop, whether his mother had a boyfriend yet, or whether she was too busy filing to bother finding one. Caleb, to his enormous credit, didn't answer him, just kept walking, and told me about it that night at dinner in the careful, unbothered voice of a kid who has decided not to let something rattle him. I remember sitting very still at that table, keeping my face calm for his sake, while something inside me quietly, permanently recalibrated. Tyler, meanwhile, had decided that Caleb's cracked phone had been a warning shot he needn't have bothered with, because nothing had happened to him. Nothing had happened, from his perspective, because paperwork doesn't happen quickly, and men like Tyler have never once in their lives had to wait for consequences the way the rest of us do. He escalated. He let his dog dig up my garden a second time, and left a torn bag of dog food on my porch afterward like it was some kind of joke, only he understood. He started parking his truck at an angle that blocked half of my driveway, always with some excuse ready, always somehow never actually apologetic. And on the last Saturday of July, at a neighborhood block party that half the cul-de-sac had been looking forward to for weeks, he did something that finally, completely, ended whatever restraint I had been holding on to. The block party was Mrs. Acaffer's idea, the woman who lived across from me and had been organizing some version of it every summer since before I moved in. Folding tables lined the sidewalk. Someone's ancient grill sent up curls of smoke that smelled like charcoal and burnt sugar. Kids ran through a sprinkler someone had rigged up in the Hendersons' front yard, and for a few hours that afternoon, the whole street felt like the kind of place I had actually wanted to raise my son in. Caleb was at the far end of the lawn with 2 other boys from his class, working through some elaborate game involving a soccer ball and a set of rules only 11-year-olds ever fully understand. And I was standing near the grill with a paper plate, talking to Mrs. Acaffer about her tomato plants, when the Kanes arrived. They walked down the middle of the street the way they walked everywhere, 3 men wide, forcing an elderly neighbor with a walker to step onto the grass to let them pass. Walter had his phone in one hand and the particular strut of a man arriving somewhere he expects to be celebrated. Tyler walked slightly ahead of him, already wrapped, already loose in the shoulders, the way a fighter warms up before he's decided to actually fight anyone. He stopped in front of me, close enough that the whole street noticed, and threw a pair of gloves onto the grass at my feet. I want you to hear exactly what he said, because I've thought about it many times since. "Get in the ring, Miss Paperwork, or I'll drag you and myself and let everyone watch what happens to a woman who thinks she can tell my family what to do." His voice carried the whole length of the street. Conversations stopped. Someone's radio kept playing, tinny and absurd against the sudden silence. Walter stood behind his son with his arms crossed, actually smiling, actually enjoying the prospect of watching a grown man hurt a woman in front of a crowd of neighbors and children on a Saturday afternoon. I looked past Tyler, past Walter, and I found Caleb at the edge of the lawn, frozen, his hands gripping the hem of his shirt, watching me the exact way a child watches the one adult in the world he has decided, without ever having to be told, is the person who keeps him safe. I understood, standing there, that if I walked away from this, if I let Tyler's challenge stand unanswered in front of 40 of our neighbors, the message that would settle over that street for years would not be about me at all. It would be about what my son was and wasn't allowed to expect the world to do to people who couldn't defend themselves. I was not going to let that message win. I set my paper plate down on the nearest table. I told Caleb, with a small, steady nod I hoped would tell him everything he needed to know, that it was all right. And then I turned back to Tyler and I said one thing, quietly enough that only the people closest to us actually heard it. "When you want to stop, stay on the ground." I wanted on record that I gave him every possible chance to simply walk away, because that has always mattered to me, in every version of my life where I've had to do something like this. He didn't take it. He never really had the instincts to. What happened over the next 90 seconds has been described to me since by people who watched it happen, because I was too inside it, too focused, to experience it the way they did. Tyler came at me with a heavy overhand right, the kind of punch built to end things quickly against someone who has never had to defend against one. I want to explain, briefly, what 6 years of army training and a lifetime of paying attention actually gives a person in a moment like that, because it isn't superhuman speed or strength. It's information. It's seeing his shoulder dip a half-second before his fist ever moved, seeing his weight settle onto his heels instead of the balls of his feet, understanding, the way you understand a sentence, exactly where his balance was going to be before he even finished committing to the punch. I stepped inside the arc of it instead of away from it, which is the part that always seems to surprise people who have never been trained to do it, because every instinct in an untrained body says to retreat. His fist went past my ear close enough that I felt the air move. Before he could recover his balance, I used both hands against his own forward momentum, redirected 230 pounds of committed weight along a different line than the one his brain had already decided it was traveling, and let physics finish the sentence I had started. He stumbled past me and caught himself on his hands at the edge of the lawn, and the whole street went completely, totally silent. He came at me a second time, angrier now, wilder, and threw a spinning kick that had clearly worked for him against overmatched amateur opponents in a ring with padded mats, and a referee ready to stop things before they went too far. There was no referee here. There was only a driveway and a fence and a woman who had spent 6 years learning exactly what to do when someone turns their back on you mid-rotation. I stepped into the blind spot his own kick created, hooked his ankle, and used his own momentum against the earth instead of against me. He landed hard enough that I felt it through my boots, the air driven completely out of his lungs in one ragged, silent gasp. I dropped my weight onto him before he could recover it, pinned his shoulder against the grass, and I said quietly, close enough that only he could hear it, that he could tap the ground any time he wanted this to stop. 5 seconds later, his hand hit the grass 3 times. I stood up. I straightened my shirt. I did not gloat because gloating was never the point, and because I could feel, even in that adrenaline-soaked moment, that the actual reckoning for this family had nothing to do with a fistfight on a suburban lawn, and everything to do with a file sitting on my desk downtown. Walter did what men like Walter always do when the world stops cooperating with the story they've built about themselves. He screamed. He called me unhinged, dangerous, a liability to the whole street, and when two neighbors, including a 16-year-old with his phone already recording, calmly explained that they'd watched the entire thing and that Tyler had thrown the first punch after physically challenging me in front of 40 witnesses, Walter's fury only sharpened into something colder and more deliberate. He pointed a finger at me, hands shaking, and told me, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that I had no idea who I was dealing with, that he had more money and more power in this town than I could possibly imagine, and that he would personally make sure I regretted every second of what I'd just done. I looked at him, and I felt something I want to be honest about, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and a little bit sad, the particular sadness of watching a man be so completely convinced of his own invincibility that he couldn't recognize the sound of his own foundation beginning to crack. I told him calmly that I hoped he had a good lawyer, and I turned around and walked back to my son, who was standing exactly where I'd left him, still watching me with that same wide, careful attention, and I realized, walking toward him across that lawn, that whatever happened next, he had just watched his mother refuse to be small in front of an entire street, and that was worth more to me in that moment than anything Walter Kane could have threatened me with. In the days right after the block party, before Walter made his call, the neighborhood settled into a strange, watchful quiet that I remember almost as vividly as the fight itself. Mrs. Ackhaffer brought over a plate of banana bread the following morning, standing on my porch a little longer than the bread alone required, and told me, in her careful, measured way, that she'd lived on that street for 19 years and never once seen anything like what happened on that lawn. She didn't say whether she approved or disapproved. She just said it, the way you'd report the weather, and then she asked if Caleb was all right, which I think was really the question underneath all of it. Mr. Alvarez's old neighbor, a retired postal worker named Frank who had lived 2 doors down since before I moved in, stopped me at my mailbox that same week and told me something I've held on to since. He said he'd spent 30 years delivering mail to men exactly like Walter Kane, men who mistook the size of their house for the size of their character, and that watching Tyler hit the ground on that lawn was, in his words, the most satisfying thing he'd witnessed on this street since the 4th of July fireworks display 2 neighborhoods over accidentally set a mailbox on fire in 2003. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. Caleb, for his part, didn't bring it up much, not directly. But I noticed, in the days after, that he stood a little differently when he walked to the bus stop, shoulders back in a way they hadn't been before, and that when a group of older kids from the next street over tried to cut in line ahead of him at the community pool that Wednesday, he held his ground, calm and unbothered, in a way that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with finally understanding that he didn't have to shrink from anyone. I didn't teach him that lesson on purpose. I don't think you ever really can. He just watched it happen, the way kids always do, and took from it exactly what he needed. It was against that backdrop, that fragile, still settling quiet, that Walter Kane decided his next move would be to try to have me fired from a job he didn't actually understand the full shape of. Walter's actual move, the one he genuinely believed would finish me, came 4 days later, and it moved through channels I understood far better than he did. He had, over the previous 2 years, cultivated a relationship with a state senator through campaign donations and a seat on a regional development board, the kind of relationship that men like Walter believe functions as a permanent, universal key to every locked door they'll ever encounter. He used that relationship to get a phone call placed directly to the regional director of the Federal Examiner's office where I worked, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had run that office for 11 years and had, in that time, developed an extremely precise sense of what it sounded like when someone was trying to lean on her. Walter's story, relayed through the senator's office and then through Carol's, was that I was a dangerously unstable employee who had violently assaulted his son in an unprovoked attack, that I had a documented history of erratic behavior, and that unless I was terminated immediately, he would be forced to consider what other regulatory relationships his company might need to reconsider, a not particularly subtle threat aimed at an office that, as it happens, had absolutely no jurisdiction over anything Walter's political connections could actually touch. Carol called me into her office that same afternoon. I remember sitting across from her, watching her set her reading glasses down on top of a printed email, and waiting for whatever was coming next with the particular calm you learn when you've already done everything right and simply have to trust that the paperwork will speak for itself. "I have a very strange phone call to tell you about," she said, and then she told me, word for word, what Walter had said. When she finished, she looked at me and asked one simple question. "Is there anything about this I need to know that isn't already in your conflict disclosure file?" I told her everything calmly, in order. The neighbor conflict, disclosed weeks earlier. The physical altercation at the block party, which by that point had already generated a police report clearing me of any wrongdoing, since Tyler had been the aggressor in front of dozens of witnesses. And the Meridian Point development case file, which I reminded her I had flagged the moment I recognized the connection, and which had been proceeding entirely through the normal chain of review with Patricia's full oversight. Carol sat back in her chair for a long moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since, because I think it captures, better than almost anything else in this story, exactly how badly Walter Kane had misjudged the entire situation. He just called a federal office to demand we fire the examiner who is currently building the fraud case against his own company, she said. He doesn't know that's what he did, but he's about to find out. I want to slow down here, because I think the next part deserves to be told carefully rather than rushed, since it's the part of this story that never had anything to do with a fistfight at all, and everything to do with numbers on a page. The Meridian Point development investigation, once I was cleared to continue on it with an additional layer of independent oversight added purely as a formality, moved forward over the following 6 weeks with the specific, patient thoroughness that this kind of work requires. What we found, ultimately, was not a single dramatic crime, but a pattern of smaller ones stacked carefully on top of each other. Duplicate invoices submitted under slightly altered vendor names to inflate reported construction costs. Federal loan funds drawn down against construction milestones that inspection records showed had never actually been reached. A shell subsidiary used to funnel a portion of the disbursed funds toward an unrelated luxury property acquisition, the very estate, as it happened, at the end of my own cul-de-sac. None of this was hidden by any special genius. It was hidden the way most fraud is hidden, behind the simple, dangerous assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough to notice, because the men committing it had never once in their lives been examined by anyone they couldn't buy off, intimidate, or outlast. They had never met someone like me, whose entire professional life had been built around exactly that kind of patient, unglamorous scrutiny, and who could not be bought, intimidated, or outlasted, because I had absolutely nothing left to lose by simply doing my job correctly. The case was referred, in the end, not just for civil penalties, but for criminal fraud charges, since the pattern of falsified documentation crossed the threshold from regulatory violation into deliberate deception of federal auditors. I was not the one who made that determination. That decision moved up through channels far above my desk, through federal prosecutors who reviewed the file independently and reached their own conclusions. But I was the one who built the file that made that conclusion possible. One invoice, one disbursement record, one quiet evening after my son had gone to bed, at a time. The collapse, once it started, moved faster than I think even Walter himself was prepared for. The federal loan guarantee backing Meridian Point's construction project was suspended pending investigation, which triggered an immediate default clause with the private lenders who had co-financed the project, who in turn called their own loans due in full. 2 of Walter's largest ongoing developments, financed against the same over-leveraged web of credit, stalled out within weeks as contractors walked off unfinished sites they could no longer be paid to work on. His investors, a group of private equity partners who had been promised guaranteed returns tied directly to the federal contract, pulled their remaining capital the moment the suspension became public record in a regional business journal. The bank holding his primary construction loan sent formal notice requesting full financial disclosure within 30 days, the same kind of letter that, once it arrives, rarely leads anywhere good. I want to describe what that collapse actually looked like from the outside, block by block, because it happened in a way that was strangely quiet given how loud everything about the Kane family had always been up to that point. First, it was the landscaping crew who stopped showing up, the koi pond slowly clouding over with algae because nobody was left to maintain it. Then it was the home gym equipment, sold off piece by piece to a second-hand fitness dealer whose truck backed into that driveway on a gray Tuesday morning with none of the fanfare of the original delivery 7 months earlier. Then it was the cars, the lifted pickup and the 2 luxury sedans replaced, over a period of weeks, by a single practical hatchback that looked almost apologetic parked where the others used to sit. Neighbors noticed all of it, the way neighbors always notice everything, and nobody said much out loud. But I think all of us understood we were watching something end in real time, one delivery truck at a time. Renee, my sister, found herself standing in the middle of a collapse she never fully understood, because she had never asked the kinds of questions that might have let her see it coming. The heated floors in her new master bathroom stayed warm through all of it, at least for a while, because utilities are usually among the last things to go. But the marriage that had carried her into that house began fracturing under the same pressure that was fracturing everything else Walter Kane had built. And by early autumn, Derek had moved out of the house they'd shared, back into an apartment near his old office, an office that, within another 2 months, would no longer exist in any meaningful sense. I did not celebrate any of it. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, more than the fight on the lawn, more than the case file, more than any single confrontation. There is no satisfaction in watching a family unravel, even a family that has spent months trying to make you feel small in front of your own child. What I felt, watching the moving trucks pull into the Kane driveway again in October, this time to take everything back out, was something closer to relief, the specific, quiet relief of watching a threat finally, completely, leave the perimeter of your life. I remember standing at my kitchen window that October morning, the same window I'd stood at back in April watching the first trucks arrive, and thinking about how strange it was that the 2 scenes looked almost identical from the outside, boxes, movers, a driveway full of motion, and yet meant something so entirely different underneath. In April, that driveway had represented an arrival, a threat settling in next to everything I'd worked to build. In October, it represented a closing, the last chapter of something that had cost my family 4 months of quiet fear folding itself up and driving away for good. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just watched, the way you watch weather finally clear after a long storm, grateful and a little tired, and not yet quite ready to fully believe it was over. Tyler never fought again, not competitively, not that I ever heard of. The video from the block party, recorded by a 16-year-old with a cracked phone screen, had already spread through enough local group chats and community pages by the time his father's company started collapsing that the 2 stories, the humiliation on the lawn and the humiliation in the business pages, became permanently, publicly linked in a way that no amount of money was ever going to untangle. His gym, when word reached the head instructor there about what had actually happened at that block party, quietly asked him not to come back. Walter Kane, as far as I know, still believes to this day that I orchestrated his downfall out of some kind of personal vendetta, that I used my position to target him because of a fistfight his son started on my lawn. I understand why he believes that. It is, in its own way, a more comfortable story for him than the truth, which is simpler and far less flattering to him than any conspiracy could be. His company failed because he built it on falsified paperwork, and I was simply the examiner whose desk that paperwork eventually landed on. I did not choose that. I only chose not to look away from it once it did. There was a moment, about a week before the moving trucks came for the last time, when Walter tried one final approach, and I think it's worth telling because it says more about him than almost anything else in this story. He came to my door alone, no lawyer, no son standing behind him for backup, dressed down in a way I'd never seen him dress before, like a man trying to look smaller on purpose. He stood on my porch and told me that he understood I had a job to do, that he respected that now, and that surely there was some arrangement we could come to, some way to make the file move a little slower, a little softer, in exchange for something he was careful never to name outright, but that both of us understood perfectly well. I let him finish. I have found over the years that letting a man finish digging his own hole is usually more useful than stopping him halfway through. Then I told him calmly that the file wasn't mine to soften even if I wanted to, that it had moved well past my desk months earlier and into the hands of federal prosecutors who had never met either of us and had no reason to care about anything except what the documents said, and that the only thing he could do at this point that might actually help him was to stop calling people and start calling lawyers. He stood there for a moment, and something in his face changed, some final piece of the story he'd been telling himself finally giving way, and then he turned and walked back across the fence line without another word. I never spoke to him again after that. The last time I saw Walter Kane in person, he was standing in his own driveway in early November, directing movers as they carried out the same Italian sectional I had watched them carry in 7 months earlier, now sold to cover a fraction of what he owed. He looked older than he had in April, smaller somehow, though nothing about his actual size had changed. He caught my eye across the fence line for just a moment, and I want to tell you that something passed between us in that look, some flicker of understanding, but the truth is simpler than that too. He just looked away first, the way men like Walter always eventually do, once they finally understand that looking away is the only move they have left. I heard, secondhand, through Mrs. Acaffer, who heard it from someone at her church, that Walter eventually pleaded to a reduced set of charges rather than face a full federal trial, that Meridian Point Development was formally dissolved by the state within the year, and that Kane Regional Holdings itself limped along under new court-appointed financial oversight for the better part of 2 years before what remained of it was finally sold off in pieces to pay down what was owed. I never went looking for those details myself. By the time they reached me, they felt like they belonged to a different life, one that had already closed its book and moved on to the next chapter without needing my permission to do it. Renee came to see me once more before she moved out of the neighborhood entirely, back to an apartment closer to where our parents still lived. She stood on my porch, not walking in the way she used to, and she didn't ask for coffee. She just stood there for a long moment, looking at the crayon drawings still taped to my refrigerator door through the window behind me, and she said she was sorry, quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since we were kids. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it, because carrying that particular weight forward would have cost me more than it would ever have cost her. We are not close now, not the way sisters in movies are close, but we talk sometimes, careful, ordinary conversations about nothing in particular, and I think, for now, that has to be enough. I think often about the version of that summer where I never disclosed the conflict, where I quietly asked to be reassigned and let someone else, some examiner with no personal stake in the outcome, take over the Meridian Point file instead. It would have been easier in some ways. It would have meant fewer sleepless nights at my kitchen table, fewer moments of sitting perfectly still while I confirmed, invoice by invoice, exactly how deep the fraud actually ran. But I don't think it would have been right, and I don't think, looking back, that it would have taught Caleb the thing I actually wanted him to learn from all of it, which has never been about winning a fight on a lawn. It's about doing the quiet, unglamorous, correct thing even when nobody is watching, especially when nobody is watching, because that is where character actually lives, not in the moments everyone can see. Patricia retired the following spring, and at her small office send-off, she pulled me aside with a paper cup of bad coffee in her hand and told me that the Meridian Point file was, in her words, the cleanest, most airtight case that had crossed her desk in over a decade, and that she wanted me to know that whatever anyone in this town believed about why it happened, the actual record would always show exactly what it was, which was simply good, careful work done by someone who refused to look away. I have kept that sentence with me since, folded away somewhere quiet, the way you keep the things that actually matter. Caleb asked me, a few weeks after the block party, once the video had made its way through his own school group chat in the way these things do, whether I had always known how to do what I did on that lawn. I told him the truth, which is that I had spent a long time learning it, in places and situations I hoped he would never have to know much about, and that I had hoped, every single day since he was born, that he would never need to see any part of it. He thought about that for a moment, the way he thinks about everything, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with his homework forgotten beside him. And then he asked if I would teach him some of it anyway, not to hurt anyone. He said, just so he'd know what it felt like to not be afraid. Not of a boy at school, not of anything. Not ever again in the specific, hollowed-out way he'd felt standing at the edge of that lawn watching a man 3 times his size throw gloves at his mother's feet. I told him that fear like that never fully disappears for anyone, not even for people who have spent years training against it, and that the goal was never really to stop being afraid at all. The goal was to know exactly what to do with it when it showed up, to let it sharpen you instead of shrink you, the way it had sharpened me on every rooftop and in every briefing room I'd ever stood in during those 6 years before he was born. He nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're filing something away for later, and asked when we could start, and I told him Saturday, and watched something settle in his shoulders that had been sitting there, unspoken, since the day a stranger 3 times his size cracked his phone against the driveway and laughed about it. I told him I would. And on Saturday mornings now, before the neighborhood is fully awake, the 2 of us stand in the backyard where a punching bag used to hang against a fence that has long since been replaced. And I teach him, slowly, patiently, the same quiet, careful discipline that once carried me through rooms far more dangerous than any suburban lawn. The discipline of paying attention, of staying calm, of never needing to be the loudest person in any room to be the one who actually understands it best. Josh, the young examiner who spent those 2 months with me matching invoices against weather reports and shipping manifests, transferred to a larger regional office the following year, and he still calls me sometimes when a file crosses his desk that reminds him of ours, just to talk it through, the way you call an old teammate when you're facing something familiar. I tell him the same thing every time. Follow the paper. Ignore the noise. The truth is always sitting there in the numbers, patient and unbothered by how loudly anyone yells about it, waiting only for someone willing to sit with it long enough to let it speak. The fence between our old lot and the Kane property still stands, though the house behind it belongs to a young family now, a nurse and a schoolteacher with 2 small kids and an entirely unremarkable golden retriever who barks exactly twice a night and then settles down. Sometimes, standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee the way I have every morning for years, I catch myself scanning the tree line anyway, the fence line, the driveway, the old habit that never fully leaves you no matter how safe your life eventually becomes. But there is nothing to catalog anymore, no threat waiting behind a hedge of ornamental palms, no engine idling too long at the end of the driveway. There's only Caleb's bicycle leaning against the porch steps, and the ordinary, hard-won quiet of a life that finally, completely, belongs to us. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up at all, whether I regret any part of it, whether I wish I'd handled Tyler differently on that lawn, whether I wish I'd asked to be taken off the Meridian Point file the moment I recognize the name. I always give them the same honest answer. I regret none of it, not because it was easy, and not because I enjoyed any single moment of the conflict itself, but because every part of it, the fistfight, the file, the quiet, patient months of cross-referencing invoices at my kitchen table, was simply the truth doing what the truth always eventually does when you refuse to look away from it. It finds its way to the surface. It always does. Sometimes it just needs someone patient enough and stubborn enough to sit with it long enough to let it rise. I think about Walter Kane sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to the specific, distant curiosity you feel toward a storm that's long since passed over. I wonder if he ever understood, really understood, that none of what happened to him was personal, that I never once altered a single number to punish him, that the numbers were simply true, and he was simply the man who happened to be standing behind them. I don't know if he ever will understand that. I've made my peace with the possibility that he never does. What I know for certain, standing here now with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter, and my son's laughter drifting in from the backyard, where he's practicing the footwork I taught him last weekend, is that the quiet ones on any street, in any office, in any family, are so often the ones holding the actual weight of everything, patiently, without needing anyone to notice, until the exact moment it matters most. If you believe that the loudest people in any room are usually the ones with the most to hide, and that the ones who stay quiet are very often the ones actually holding all the power, tell me in the comments. And let me know if you've ever had to prove someone wrong about exactly how small they thought you were. Sometimes the woman they call Miss Paperwork is the only one in the building who actually knows how the whole story ends. And sometimes the quietest person at the party is simply waiting for the right moment to prove it.